I received a free review copy of Dawn of Ulos from the publisher, so thanks to Thunderworks. Competing gods influence the development of territories for warring factions in Thunderworks' fantasy universe. Dawn of Ulos is a tile-laying stock market game dressed up as a high fantasy battle. Acquire meets Tigris and Euphrates meets Small World. That's the hook. I'm Adam Porter, I'm a game designer from Wales and I review games on this channel with a focus on product design. If you like what I do, please subscribe, comment and share the video. Dawn of Ulos is the fifth game in the fantasy world of Ulos, which was introduced in 2016 with the dice drafting game Role Player. Each game in the series is radically different. It was 2019's Cartographers which caught my attention, a map building flip and write which rapidly became one of my favourite games. 2019's Eurogame Lockup and 2023's Trick Taker Goblin Vaults complete the series, and several of these games have featured expansions and standalone sequels. On paper, Dawn of Ulos is right up my street, a fairly light stock market game. I love Haben Gut, Black Friday, Airlines Europe and Arcadia. Tile laying with conflicts inspired by Tigris and Euphrates, which is one of my very favourite games. The fantastical theme would have led me to ignore the game, dismissing it as just another Tolkien-esque battler, were it not for the publisher bringing the game to my attention. Aware of my love for Cartographers, they suggested that I gave the game a try. I was happy to do so. Dawn of Ulos is a light to medium complexity economic game for 1 to 5 players from first-time board game designer Jason Lentz. It plays in 90 minutes or so. Players attempt to earn the most favour, the currency of the game. On your turn you place a tile, often strengthening one of the factions indicated on the board by these plastic markers. No one owns these factions, but on your turn you can use favour to purchase cards corresponding to each of them. Alternatively, you can return a card to the supply, gaining favour according to the current position of the faction marker on the track, and using the faction's power. There are all manner of chaotic effects on offer here. Move a tile to a new position, reveal cards from another player's hand and claim rewards, or draw and place an extra tile. Connecting a territory to a purple rift tile awards a player with a single-use ability they can utilise on a later turn. And placing a tile such that 2 territories are joined up brings about a conflict. All players simultaneously reveal cards from their hands to bolster their chosen faction's strengths. And the losing faction is kicked off the board, reducing the value of all corresponding cards in players' hands. Cards used in the conflict earn the players spoils, additional favour tokens equal to their current position on the track. So the various territories expand across the map as the game progresses, with players aiming to purchase cards when they're cheap and discard them for their effects when they're at the height of their power. At the end of the game, all cards remaining in hand are awarded favour equal to the corresponding faction's strength, and the player with the most favour wins. There are 10 factions in the box, each with a different power, and only 5 are used in each game, giving a good amount of variety between sessions. And as always, we'll start with onboarding, the process of attracting a consumer to a product and turning them into a committed user. With board games, frequently the first impression is taken from the box cover. Now, I believe a great cover should show you what you're going to be doing in a game and how you're going to feel. The Dawn of Ulos box is pretty substantial. There's some depth to the packaging to make room for those sizable plastic tokens, and the box image is bright, colourful and beautifully drawn by Brazilian artist Diego Sá. The issue with the illustration is not the quality of it, but the totally misleading nature of it. An elf stands at centre stage with sword aloft, ready to bury it into the cranium of a goblin in a packed battlefield. A dragon roars in the background, providing a fiery backdrop for the epic tableau. What is this package promising? The big box and high price point suggests substantial content, a lengthy game, some complexity, perhaps a campaign. The battlefield imagery suggests a thematic experience, perhaps some area control, army building, dice rolling and tactical warfare. We get none of that, at all. The miscommunication impacts on rules learning too. The rulebook is not badly written, it's pretty simple and it all makes sense, but it's hard to shake off the expectations created by the cover, and confusing that companies are called factions, shares are faction cards, money is favour, and stock prices are strength and spoils. There's a cognitive leap to make at every stage. And this is a problem. It's not entirely clear who this game is for. The fantasy overlay is likely to put off economic gamers, a rather niche audience at the best of times, and the stock market manipulation is likely to come as something of a surprise to fans of high fantasy thematic games looking for another D&D inspired battle game. The game falls into the same category as another of my favourites, Bruno Cathala and Charles Chevalier's Abyss, a game which famously features beautiful thematic visuals which are entirely out of keeping with the dry, strategic Euro-style card play. Now I'm going to find it hard to get people to play this game with me, and that's a shame, because it's really fun. I rate games for engagement using my own ladder system. Games are awarded 0 to 3 points in 5 different categories, and each point scored climbs the game one rung up the ladder. A score of 10 or above tops the ladder and indicates a real favourite with me. Thematic immersion in Dawn of Ulos is weak. It's a fantasy overlay on a generic stockholding game with growing companies, mergers and values rising and falling in a volatile market. The presentation, however, is good. The map recalls other fantastical games like Kingdom Builder, Terra Mystica and Small World, and each individual power is assigned to a specific race, with Diego Sa's glorious artwork adorning every card. The greatest strength of the game is the interaction between players. The market is entirely driven by player choices, so it's vital to remember which cards your opponents are hoarding to anticipate their next move. If they're going all in on goblins, should I follow suit before they get too expensive? Or should I destroy the goblin territory by connecting with the dwarves, bringing them into conflict? When those conflicts occur, there's a whole other level of guessing, second-guessing and bluffing, as all players assign cards from their hand to strengthen the various factions involved. Each player will lose at least half of the cards which they utilise in this way, but they do gain spoils at the current market value, even if a faction's strength is about to plummet. So it's not always easy to determine what other players will do. Players are encouraged to make deals with each other, though these are never binding. And even though much of the game is deterministic, you can never be sure what tiles a player has in their hand, or what powers they've picked up from rifts. So it's easy for a player to throw a spanner in the works and disrupt your plans. Stress and challenge is my third category, and here I highlight game mechanisms which make you wish you could do more. Just one more action, or one more turn, keeping the game tight and tense. But the tension in this game arises once again from the interaction with other players. You know exactly what you want them to do, and if they do it, you're going to reap the rewards. But if they don't do it, your fortunes can swing in entirely the opposite direction. So you spend much of the game silently willing your opponents to fall into your trap. Feedback is the way in which a game responds to players' input. Rewards, punishments and special actions, which arise as a result of the player's own choices. Dawn of Ulos features quite a lot of feedback. Playing a card always generates income, but also gives you a special action. Playing terrain near rift tiles awards players with powerful one-off abilities. And whether your preferred faction wins or loses in a conflict, you gain favour just for taking part. This is not a game full of long-term strategy. Player choices are impactful. In fact, they can turn the game on its head in a single turn. But they're often based on reading the board state at that very moment and making a tactical choice about how to raise your stock and keep your opponents down. But many of these choices are limited by the terrain tiles that you have in hand, and these are randomly drawn. If you don't have the right terrain type to raise your favoured faction's strength, or to join two territories and bring them into conflict, your turn can be underwhelming. This is not a deep strategic experience, it's chaotic and it's swingy, especially when compared to other stock market games where crashes can be predicted a little more accurately and prepared for. In Dawn of Ulos, every turn feels like you're on the edge of disaster. The overall score of 9 is great. It doesn't quite top the ladder, it's not destined to be an evergreen classic, but it is very engaging. It clips along at a fair pace, turns are short and full of drama. This is not a game you're going to play to show off your economic wiles. It's a game to play for the experience and the interaction, laughing at your misfortune and that of your opponents. Moving on to my product design checklist. Is the game innovative? Well, that's hard to say. It's very clear that this game was heavily inspired by the classic Sid Sackson game Acquire, and there's more than a hint of Nietzsche's Tigris and Euphrates in there too. But the result doesn't really feel like any other game in my collection, and if that's innovation, well then I guess it fulfills the criteria. I think Dawn of Ulos is an interesting example of what happens when you don't use a design thinking approach to your designs. Design thinking involves first understanding your audience, empathizing with them, then identifying a problem which you can resolve with a product. Only then do you ideate, prototype, and start testing. Few first-time designers think in those terms. A very common bit of advice thrown around in board game design circles is design a game that you would want to play. And that's all very good if you closely resemble the majority of gamers or game purchasers. But it's not so helpful if you represent a tiny niche of gamers. Dawn of Ulos feels like a labour of love. Now, I don't know anything about Jason Lentz, but I can imagine that he's a fan of Acquire, but felt it could be livened up with some special powers and a more fantastical setting. Perhaps he drew some inspiration from the conflict in Tigris and Euphrates, another favourite game, and presented his hybrid to a group of friends who represent a similar niche, and they all gushed with praise for the prototype game. This is the experience of many new designers, and it results in gloriously weird products like this one. Now, I love oddities like this, but in my experience, the market doesn't. Which brings me neatly on to my next product design question. Does this game fulfill a need, solve a problem, or fill a gap in the market? And unfortunately, I don't see it. I'm not convinced there are all that many consumers crying out for a stockholding game overlaid with the trappings of a fantasy battlefield and made more chaotic by the inclusion of special abilities and faction powers. I fall into that very small niche. I thoroughly enjoy the game, but I'm not your typical consumer at all. Does the product have the potential to grow with its user? Yeah, this is a real strength of the product. There's a lot of variety in the box. You can only use 5 of the 10 powers in each game, allowing for a huge number of possible combinations. And the board layout is different every time, and the randomized rift tokens can be impactful too. There's huge scope for expansions, both in terms of new cards and powers, or even the inclusion of totally new mechanisms. The system is currently pretty lean. There's not a lot to learn, so it could withhold additional complexity in future releases. But most significantly, the game experience revolves around player interaction, and this could easily result in a metagame forming between players in a regular group, learning the game system, but also their opponents' likely moves, and developing rivalries and alliances which extend across sessions. I think it's a real strength of the product. And finally, let's talk branding. Well, Thunderworks made the bold decision very early in their life as a board game publisher to set all their games in the same fantasy world. Similar strategy to the British publisher City of Games, whose hit tile-laying game Isle of Cats occupies the same fantasy world as their epic fantasy game City of Kings, as well as all other titles in their catalogue. Thunderworks had a hit with their first game, Role Player, which made a game out of rolling up statistics for a generic fantasy role-playing character. And that generic fantasy setting formed the backdrop for Cartographers, which is a superb flip and write game, in my view, the very best in a crowded genre. 2 concurrent hits has allowed Thunderworks to experiment with other titles with diverse systems at their core. A Euro game, a trick-taking game, and now an economic game. The universe might be generic, but it's well loved because of the early hits from this publisher, and that branding gives a lifeline to Dawn of Ulos that it might not have been offered under the banner of another publisher. Put simply, the Thunderworks branding is a seal of quality that gamers trust, so they may be willing to experiment with a game system that's a little bit outside their comfort zone. An outstanding commercial product combines a phenomenal idea with perfect execution, hence occupying the red or orange part of my matrix. This is where the evergreen titles live. Wingspan, Ticket to Ride, Pandemic. Games occupy in the opposite corner, the blue section, are much more likely to struggle in the marketplace, even if, when given a chance, they might offer up a really engaging experience. The idea of a fantasy stockholding game doesn't seem to me like a strong commercial hook. I think it's more likely to confuse than attract potential consumers. But the execution of that idea is good, both in terms of the publisher's outstanding presentation and the designer's gameplay system, which provides an engaging experience. Ultimately, the game sits in the green section of the grid, indicating that the game will not be a commercial hit, but not a flop either. Publishers' catalogues are full of these in-between titles, the steady sellers which provide their loyal fans with enjoyable new content to explore while waiting for the next big thing. Now, I'm sure there are a substantial number of you out there who occupy the same niche as myself and apparently Jason Lentz. Those who enjoy the highs and lows of gambling on a fictional stock market and enjoy a bit of chaos thrown into the mix. This game really isn't about the destination. The ultimate victor is likely to look a bit baffled and ask, how did that happen? And that's the key to enjoying this game. It's all about the journey. If you enjoyed this video, you'll find many other similar reviews and product breakdowns on my channel, so please follow the links.